All right. Welcome to the B Block Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Scott. I am glad that you are here with me. And I just got to start with the fact that this was easily the weirdest football watching experience that I've ever had in my life. Without a question about it. Here I am, bar hopping around town, watching this Texans season finale because, as we all know, this was going to be the last game of for the Texans this season. Implications for the number one overall pick on the line. There was nothing more important for the Texans than losing this game. I had been saying on the radio for the past, I don't know, week plus that the best argument, or I should say, the only way that the Texans could win that game would be by losing it. The only way that the Texans could win that last game of the season was by losing it because the number one overall pick depended on it. So with that in mind, and I'd said the game before that with the Jaguars, it was important for them to lose that game as well to stay in position for the number one overall pick. Said that game was awkward because it was the last home game of the season, and there was this feeling of, hey, you're rooting for the team to lose. It is counterintuitive to how fandom works, but that was the situation, has been the situation for the last several weeks, was certainly the situation going into the final game of the season. And here I am consuming this game with the hope and with the intent of watching the Texans secure the number one overall pick with a loss to the Indianapolis Colts in the season finale. And meanwhile, on the other side of it is the Chicago Bears with the opportunity to steal the number one overall pick so long as they lose, which they did, and so long as the Texans win, which they obviously did as well. But not just that, but the head coach in charge of whatever happens with the Texans, win or lose, was the former Bears head coach Lovie Smith. Okay, so part of the Bears' fate lies in Lovie Smith, who obviously has a great history in Chicago as being one of the more successful coaches, if not, I guess, the most successful coach that they've had in the last 30 years. The last one to take them to the Super Bowl. And then the second bar that I go to, which was one that I had been to a couple of days before, had a good time, went there again. This is around the second half. I pull up to the bar, go outside because it's a beautiful day. The weather's been excellent for the most part. We've had a couple of showers here and there here in Houston, but for the most part, the weather has been excellent. And on Sunday afternoon, it was excellent again. I pull up, go outside, and who do I see sitting there at a table full of folks? Dennis damn Rodman. Dennis Rodman, the worm, sitting there at a table, just chilling, talking it up, chatting it up. Everybody at this table, it's about 6 or 7 people at the table, hanging on to every word of Dennis Rodman. And it didn't hit me until maybe after the game, after I'd gotten a chance to speak to Dennis Rodman and after the Texans had squandered the number one overall pick, it didn't hit me how much Chicago was hovering over me and in this moment. Okay. Because you got Lovie Smith with the Chicago history, in a lot of ways, maybe indirectly, maybe not so indirectly, fighting for Chicago to all but secure that they get the number one overall pick by having maybe the best coaching effort and the players themselves maybe playing the best game, one of the best games that they played all year, probably the best game that they played all year. And just coincidentally, as I'm watching all of this, here I run into another Chicago legend and one of the more bizarre ones that you'll find just hanging out in Houston. And I had seen some photos on social media of folks who had run into Dennis Rodman around town. And so I figured when I saw him, it did not surprise me to see Dennis Rodman in Houston necessarily, but it is a surprise when you're just minding your own business, not expecting to see necessarily anyone famous or noteworthy. And the person that you see would be someone as random and as bizarre, honestly, as Dennis Rodman, and also have the Chicago ties in a time or at a time and in a moment where it is basically Houston versus Chicago, Houston versus Chicago in the battle of the best loser and who could lose the best. And it turned out to be Chicago winning by losing. But that was just a weird sort of surrounding of the whole thing of all of this Chicago in my face as Houston is squandering the number one overall pick through the former Chicago coach. And I got to say, it is a game where two people stand out for me. You know, aside from what the Texans were able to do, playing a good game, Davis Mills, aside from the turnovers, which seems like is the thing that you always say about Davis Mills, is that aside from the turnovers, aside from the interceptions or a fumble or a pick six here or there, it is just fine. There are some flashes. You see some things of why Davis Mills is in this position, why he would be in a position like this. But it wasn't even anybody on the Texans, and I'm giving them credit for the game that they played. They played a pretty damn good game, albeit at a time, the worst possible time that they could have played a good game. But the players that stand out to me from this game are from the Colts, and they're the ones that Texans fans, I feel like, should hate for eternity. Sports hate, of course, but Texans fans should sports hate these guys for eternity, and Bears fans should maybe even put them in the Ring of Honor if that's the type of thing that I'm sure they got one of those over there at Hallis Hall. Colts linebacker Cameron McGrone and defensive back Rodney Thomas II. These are the two guys that made sure that the Texans would not have the number one overall pick and that the Bears would secure it. And I'll tell you what I mean. McGrone, mind you, the Texans marched down on their opening drive for a touchdown, something that I think they'd only done a couple of times all year. Not something that they were accustomed to doing, just striking first, starting off hot. Not a thing that they do. They did it in this game. Well, the Colts were in prime position to respond, albeit with Sam Ehlinger at quarterback. And my God, Sam, goodness God, Sam. If this was an audition for Sam as just being a career backup quarterback, where it's just as a guy who could continue to have a career in the league, like a la Colt McCoy has been able to do, you know, being able to stick around for long over a decade. Man, this was not a good moment for another former Longhorn quarterback. But Cameron McGrone, linebacker playing on special teams, hits his own man on the kickoff return after the touchdown for the Texans on that first drive. At first look, you might think that it is Jalen Reeves Maven, who forced the fumble and got the Texans the ball back. But it's actually Cameron McGrone knocking the ball out of his own man's hands, or at least hitting his own guy. I'm looking at a picture of it now on social media where, yeah, he hits his guy, hits the ball, hits everything. It's Reeves Maven making the tackle, but it is for sure Cameron McGrone as the one who is knocking that ball loose, giving the Texans a chance to add to their lead and get off to a 10-0 start. The Texans getting off to a 10-0 start might not mean something against a good team, but against a team like the Colts that is basically just as bad as the Texans are, it meant a lot. It meant a whole lot. And especially in a game where you look up and the difference is decided. Like the first game that they played ended in a tie, and this one ends as a 1-point game. And we'll get to Lovie Smith going for 2 in just a second, because that was the more fascinating and certainly the more frustrating part from a Texans perspective, to see that not only not only did he run counter to something that he had done previous in the season when they went for the tie, but it was completely unnecessary. No reason why you would feel the need to go for two and win that game. Seemingly a middle finger to the Texans for probably, at that point, everyone seeing the writing on the wall, knowing that Lovie Smith wasn't going to be back. And it's like, why do this? Very, very, very curious decision there from Lovie Smith, and just a hell of a moment for, I think, a hell of a moment in Texans history and Houston sports history. Lovie Smith deciding to go for it, to go for two in that moment. But Cameron McGrone is the one that gives you life. Maybe depending on how you look at it, right? Gives you life as a Bears fan to say, hey, the Texans might actually pull this off and win this game. And really kind of worries you. I know I was worried on the Texans' behalf of, hey, they might actually end up winning this. They're starting off, they're off to a 10-0, they're getting a 10-0 head start here. Being spotted 10 points to start the game. Not ideal for the result, or for the ideal result here. And then Rodney Thomas at the end of the game. So obviously before the 2-point conversion, we're talking about the Hail Mary touchdown throw on 4th down that gives the Texans, or I guess brings the Texans to within one, and gives them the opportunity to tie the game with the point after the touchdown. And of course, to take the lead with only like 50 seconds left or something like that. Like, it was less than a minute to go in the game at that point. And, if you get the 2-point conversion, you have a good chance effectively of winning the game, knowing that Sam Ehlinger is the quarterback on the other side that's in charge of leading the quick game-winning drive, even if it's just for a field goal. Not, not the best chances there for the Colts to come back. The game seemed over at that point, and certainly that is the final result. So, Hail Mary from Davis Mills to Jordan Akins there for the either, game tying or game winning touchdown. Turned out to be the game winning touchdown. And Rodney Thomas jumps up for what looked like a lollipop interception. That ball, Davis Mills threw some good balls and threw a couple of bad ones, but by and large was I thought was Davis Mills on Sunday. But this one was right there for Rodney Thomas to take. Right there, maybe one of the easiest interceptions that he would have found maybe in his career. And he mistimes his jump, and it seems like the ball goes through his hands, maybe just slightly over his hands and through his hands and right into the hands of Jordan Akins. That's a play that should not have happened. Those are two plays, the ones that I've opened this show up with, the ones that I've just described to you. Those are two plays that frankly just should not have happened. Those plays should not have happened. You do not have a guy in Cameron McGrone forcing a fumble on his own guy, which ultimately sets up a field goal drive and puts them down 10-0 to start the game, puts the Texans up 10-0 to start the game. And you don't have a guy missing a lollipop interception like that to avoid or to stop the Texans from scoring that touchdown. We can look at everything and gripe about whatever we want. Nick Caserio, the Texans general manager, for not stepping up and saying, hey, the best players on this team are not going to play. We're sitting Laramie Tunsil. We're sitting Titus Howard. We're sitting Brandon Cooks, and we're not going to, go all out with our best players. We're going to have all practice squad wide receivers, and we're not going to try to win this game. You can blame Nick Caserio for not taking it upon himself to make sure that was the situation, to make sure that was the case, because we all know and believe it to be the best case for the Texans. Okay, you can blame him for that. You can blame Lovie Smith for coaching his heart out, given probably his best coaching effort that you've seen all year from Lovie Smith, and Pep Hamilton for giving his best play calls, the play designs, the plays that set up Brandon Cooks early in the game and the touchdown that he scored, and the plays that set up the tight ends, Tegan Quatoriano and the catches that he had, Jordan Akins and the moments that he had, the even the balance of run pass and just the overall flow of the game, the play calling, as good, probably better than you've seen it all year from these guys. And you can blame them for that. if you're mad about the Texans not getting the number one overall pick and winning this game. But those are the two moments that I reflect on when I look at this game and think, my goodness, if not for these two nondescript players that I'm going to be honest, I didn't know maybe anything about before this game. Cameron McGrone and Rodney Thomas either making the wrong play or missing a play. In Cameron McGrone's case, causing a fumble on the wrong guy, your teammate. In Rodney Thomas's case, mistiming your jump and not securing maybe one of the easier interceptions that you'll ever get in your career, and allowing the Texans to score because of both of those plays. Those are the things that are going to stick out to me about this game. Now, I'm going to acknowledge something. I got a little emotional and a little bit, let's say I was a little bit inebriated. I would discourage anyone, whether you're in the business or not, to avoid social media, or at least posting on social media when you're drinking and having a good time and being around people, and emotions are flying high and all of that. And I got a little emotional about this result. I do think that it was super important, and there is a huge difference between getting the number one overall pick and getting the number two overall pick. I do think that. I believe that wholeheartedly. I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world that they didn't get it, that they got the number two overall pick, and that, they're not going to necessarily be able to control the draft. To me, that was the ideal scenario, but it does seem to be true. And this is just something that I disagree with based off of how I feel about Bryce Young specifically, or how I feel about how selecting him number one overall and just selecting him at all could change the direction of not only the Texans franchise, but any franchise that selected him. Maybe this is just a result of me overvaluing or just being really bullish on him as a player specifically. But it does not seem like or at least there is enough disagreement, right? Lack of consensus on what I'm saying about Bryce Young, the way I feel about Bryce Young, because of the questions about his size and whether that's going to be an issue for durability and all of that. Like, it does not feel like there is that same feeling and favor for and coveting of the number one overall pick to draft this guy. It does not seem that way. Like for me, I don't know, and we'll get a sense for this when we talk to Nick Caserio. I'm recording this on Monday afternoon, and we'll talk to Nick Caserio later on in the afternoon, and Cal McNair as well. And I don't think they're going to give us a good sense for who they're drafting or anything like that. But it's not like we know how they feel about the top of this draft, or that there is the same consensus that there was when, say, Trevor Lawrence was coming out, or even when Joe Burrow was coming out the year before that, or, of course, when Andrew Luck was coming out. Okay, or when Andrew Luck and Robert Griffin III were both coming out, and it was like, hey, you either get one or the other, and both of them seem pretty damn good, especially at that time. Like, I know how Robert Griffin's career ended and everything, but at that time, it seemed like it was pretty good to be Indianapolis or Washington in either situation, in either scenario, to be able to draft one of those guys. So, that's clearly not the feeling about this draft, whether it be specifically about Bryce Young, or if you're a CJ Stroud guy, it certainly doesn't seem like that's the feeling about him. And then these defensive players that seem like they could really change a defense immediately, Will Anderson and Jalen Carter. No one really seems to feel that way about them. I don't even like. I don't think that there is anything close to a consensus on who the number one overall pick should be, who the best quarterback is, or even who the best defensive player is, much less who the number one overall pick should be. So from that standpoint, I would concede that maybe I'm overvaluing the number one overall pick for who it is. Like it is true that the number one pick is more valuable than the number two pick. That is unequivocally true. That's not a matter of opinion. But in terms of who the number one overall pick is or should be, that is not as cut and dry as I think I've tried to make it in my mind or would like to believe it to be, just because I think that Bryce Young is the guy. That's just my amateur opinion, okay? And I stand strong on it. I think that there's enough evidence out there, and that there are also enough experts out there that would validate that opinion. And if you just watch the kid play, that there is plenty of justification for my belief in Bryce Young, despite his size. I think it's all there. Okay. I think you could, I mean, if you just follow his pedigree, his track record, and then the results that you saw from him at Alabama these last couple of years, I mean, it's not like a polarizing, controversial take to say Bryce Young is able to overcome his size issues and still perform at a high level. And with a couple exceptions, only a couple of exceptions, has been able to remain healthy and stay healthy for the most part during his college career. Like, I know he missed a couple of games or missed some time here and there, but for the most part, the guy played, and the guy played well. It's there. To me, it's there. It is worth the risk. And that's just how I feel about it. The evaluators and the people who actually matter, the ones that are actually going to make the decisions, might not necessarily agree. I think it's clear that there is enough room for disagreement, at the very least, that the possibility is very much there that they might not necessarily agree. So I will say that, and again, acknowledge that for me, there might be some overzealousness with the number one overall pick, because I'm just assuming, because I believe in the guy, that that's who Nick Caserio would have taken, or would have taken if he had gotten the number one overall pick, right? That's probably my bad, because that is not a safe assumption at all. Now, Lovie Smith getting fired. Well, before I get to Lovie Smith, actually, let's kind of just stay with this real quick. We'll get back to Lovie Smith. I'm gonna move this around real quick, how I had it set up, and get to the number two overall pick, because I think that that is a good discussion to have now that things are finalized and I've had a little time to let the emotions die down some and accept the fact that this is what it is. From a content standpoint, I'll say, and I think Sean Pendergast was mentioning this as well on the post game show. My colleague at Sports Radio 610 was mentioning this on the Texans post game show, that from a content standpoint, drafting Bryce Young or just simply having the number one overall pick would have been objectively more fun and interesting and compelling content to have. That would have been a more fun conversation to have from now until April. But from January until April, while you're having draft discussions or trying to build segments for radio or podcasts or whatever it may be, or things to write about, writing about who might be the number one overall pick, how that pick might change the trajectory of the franchise, what it might mean for the decision makers, and Nick Caserio as the general manager, like all of that. Having the number one overall pick was a big deal, would have been a big deal, and especially content wise, but specifically because of how it would have and could have affected the franchise, how franchise altering that can be. So I mean, that is a letdown, but there is still, there is still a draft that has to be done, and the number two overall pick is not the worst thing to have. Like, if you're looking right now at who the number two overall pick was in last year's draft, he looks pretty damn good. It's Aiden Hutchinson from Michigan, and he looked like a pretty damn good player for the Lions this year. So I think that if you were to tell Texans fans that you could get, and I think you can, based off of the four players that I just described, right? Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, Will Anderson, and Jalen Carter. Those are four players. If you're picking at two, that stands to reason that you can get one of those four players at number two. And if I were to tell you that any of the four of them could produce in the same way or in a similar fashion to Aiden Hutchinson, you would take that. You would say that is good enough. That is a good enough addition and a good enough roster talent upgrade to make a difference in where you're trying to go as a team. So I think that the number two overall pick still is very important and is a great opportunity for the Texans, for as badly of a botching as I think it is to not get the number one overall pick when it was right there in your grasp. But I make this point. And I think this is what we got to focus on, and until we know more about what the Bears' intentions might be, how they feel about Justin Fields there, and what direction they're trying to go in. I think it's still a chance, and it's still very possible that the Texans could still end up with Bryce Young if they want him. And again, I just said that I don't know for sure that they want him, that he fits their profile of what an ideal quarterback looks like or is. I think he should, but I don't know that he does. So this is something that could still happen, though. It's still something that's in play. So the scenarios that have been put out there is that if the Bears believe in Justin Fields as their quarterback of the future, if they believe that he can be and will be their franchise quarterback, then they have some flexibility there at that number one pick. If they don't, then obviously it makes sense for them to draft a quarterback. Okay. And that's an issue in and of itself. I don't know if I have, and I follow Chicago media pretty closely. I don't know if I have a great sense for or a great feeling of what they actually think about Justin Fields there in Chicago from a management standpoint. I know it's a mixed bag from the fans and media about what Justin Fields is, because he showed some, I think, showed some tremendous growth this year, but still isn't exactly what I think most people would want to see at this point as a passer, and still has a long way to go in developing as a passer. And if you're saying that about a guy going into year three, then are you also essentially saying that you might need to draft another quarterback, especially if he doesn't have those questions as a passer? Because it's if there's anything that you don't really have a question about Bryce Young, if it's the size thing, it's not, hey, how well does he process and how accurate is he and how good of a passer is he? I think you could even say the same thing about CJ Stroud as being probably a little bit more advanced from an accuracy standpoint than than Justin Fields is. So if you like either one of those two quarterbacks more than you like Justin Fields, if you're the Bears, it makes sense to just draft one of those guys and figure out exactly what you might do. Figure out exactly what you might do with Justin Fields. Do you trade him, or okay, the other option is, if you do believe in Justin Fields, is do you trade that number one overall pick to somebody that desperately needs a quarterback? And there are a few teams that fit that mold, right? I think there are a few teams that fit that profile who desperately need a quarterback, and the Texans are obviously one of them, picking there at number two. But I think that's the important thing to sort of keep in mind now. Also with this Justin Fields thing and the Bears, and I guess the part that I'm really trying to get a sense for is, or I guess I should say, the part that makes it hard to get a sense for exactly what they might do is the fact that Justin Fields was not drafted by that current regime. He was not picked by the general manager Ryan Poles, or let's see, sorry about that. He was not picked about by the general manager Ryan Poles, nor was he like hand selected by obviously by the defensive coach that is Matt Eberflus. The current regime in Chicago inherited Justin Fields from the staff that was just fired. Okay. So how much do they believe in Justin Fields? How much are they tied to and or invested in Justin Fields? I think those are questions that will be answered over the course of the next few months as we see what happens with that number one pick, what direction they go in with the draft, and certainly how that's going to impact what direction they go with Justin Fields. But it's not like you don't have, okay, the Bears, and this is the thing, even if you don't like Bryce Young, even if you don't believe in Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, or any one particular player at the top of this draft, this is the position that the Texans could have been in with the flexibility that the Bears have now, with all of these other teams that are going to be seemingly desperate to upgrade at quarterback, just as the Texans should be, just to be clear. But you got the Colts picking a few years ago. You've got the Seattle Seahawks who, hey, they could let Geno Smith walk in free agency. They could bring him back. But certainly there's a case to be made that they should reset and start over at quarterback if they feel like if they feel like they're in a position to trade up and get Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, and that could change the trajectory of their franchise. They obviously got to go do that. Like does it come down to whether they believe that the potential in a cheaper and younger Bryce Young or CJ Stroud is worth more than paying Geno Smith for having the season of his career? So you've got the Colts and the Seahawks at 4 and 5. I didn't mention the Arizona Cardinals at 3 because they've got Kyler Murray. They just paid him. They just fired Cliff Kingsbury. They're gonna have to figure things out there. But Kyler Murray is going to be the quarterback there at the very least next year for sure. So you go to the Colts at 4, the Seahawks at 5, and then the Lions. I know that Jared Goff just had a really great season, but does Detroit look at it as an opportunity to secure a young talent? Okay, a young talent at that spot, and would they be interested in moving up and getting the number 1 overall pick? Now, mind you, if I'm not mistaken, let me be sure of this. Yeah, the Lions are the only other team aside from the Texans who have 2 picks in the first round. So they are similarly situated to the Texans in terms of assets and ability to move up. And when you talk about the teams that have the most to offer the Chicago Bears and getting the number 1 overall pick, the Lions are the one. The only question there, I guess the main question there, is how do they feel about Jared Goff? Are they gonna run it back with Jared Goff? Do they feel like he's the quarterback of the future? Or are they gonna do what would probably be the wiser thing and try to invest in a younger guy who's more talented? Which I would argue Bryce Young and CJ Stroud are both. So it would be in their best interest to move up. You go and look at the team after them. It's the Las Vegas Raiders, who just clearly ended their relationship with Derek Carr after about a decade. They're going to be looking to make a change at quarterback, clearly. It would make sense. Now, I know the Tom Brady rumors are out there. I know that there's speculation of what they could do with maybe a veteran, bring somebody in like that. But they would also be in a situation of it's time to reset the clock at quarterback, do something different, bring in a talented young guy. All of these teams, man, you look up and down the order, and I just named, what is that? 1, 2, 3, 4 teams right there, and 5 if you include the Texans, where the Bears are sitting there with the world at their feet. They can either make that pick at number 1 overall, pick a quarterback if they don't believe in Justin Fields, pick a defensive player if they do believe in Justin Fields, and then really believe in one of these defensive players as somebody that could change the direction of their franchise. Or should I keep going past the Raiders? The Atlanta Falcons. I know they just drafted Desmond Ridder last year, but would you rather have Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, of the pick of one of those two, over Desmond Ridder? I think you would. The Carolina Panthers at 9. Same thing. Don't have a quarterback. Did the Sam Darnold, Baker Mayfield, did PJ Walker play for them this year? I mean, they haven't like their quarterback situation, and I'm reading here that they haven't taken a quarterback in the first round since they took Cam Newton number 1 overall in 2011. So it'll be 12 years since they got a franchise quarterback through the draft. It might be time for them to do that again. So you got all of these teams, from every team except Arizona, from pick 2 to 9, that needs a quarterback, or at least has that question right there. And the Bears sitting there with, at the very least, an option at quarterback, a young, still cheap, going into his 3rd-year quarterback who they probably feel better about after year 2 than they did after year 1. And certainly the question is still there, but they probably feel good about that guy. And if they don't, they got the number 1 overall pick. They got the number 1 overall pick, and the guy who if they don't feel as good about, the rights to his contract for the next couple of years and the ability to move him. Congratulations, man. Congratulations to the city of Chicago and to Bears fans for winning the weekend, for winning Sunday handily by losing your game and by having your former Super Bowl head coach, the last coach to take your team to the Super Bowl, come through for you again in this way. I was listening to some Chicago radio on Monday morning, and they were talking about how Lovie Smith could run for mayor right now. Apparently, they don't. There's some folks that don't like the mayoral candidates, the current mayoral candidates in Chicago, and I'm not going to pretend to know anything about the local politics in Chicago. But there seems to be this feeling that they don't have any good options for mayor in Chicago, and they wouldn't mind making Lovie Smith the mayor these days because of how he came through for them on Sunday by winning that game. Good for Chicago, man. They control the draft here because they can manipulate whatever the market dictates. If no one, I just painted the scenario of all of these teams that need a quarterback and what they could do, or them actually just being teams that could try to make a move to get up and get that number one pick from the Bears. If that market actually doesn't exist, going back to the point that I was making earlier about there being no consensus about no players at the top of the draft, about there being no consensus about Bryce Young and CJ Stroud necessarily being franchise altering, franchise changing quarterbacks. If that turns out to be the case amongst all of these teams and none of them are willing to up the ante and move up to that number one overall pick, and that mark is not there, the Bears just got the pick. They've got the pick. And if they believe in Justin Fields, they can pick a defensive player or hell, an offensive player if they like him enough, right? A weapon, because it's not like Justin Fields got anybody to throw the ball to out there in Chicago. So they got that, and their top running back is going to be a free agent, David Montgomery. Okay, so like I know they're not drafting a running back number one overall, but that the point is Justin Fields don't have no weapons in Chicago. Okay, so they could go that route or take one of these defensive players that everybody seems to like, and Will Anderson and Jalen Carter. So cool, man. How dope would this have been? How dope would this have been? Not just from a content standpoint, but honestly, man, if y'all are interested in the well-being, in the health of this organization, in the health of the Texans, if that is something that matters to you, how great would it have been to be able to dictate the draft in that way, either by picking the player that you believe in or manipulating the market and trading back, trading down, getting more picks and doing it that way. Because I know a lot of people were actually fans of that and are still fans of the idea of just simply having 2 first-round picks and being able to add some really solid pieces to your team this year. What is this? That's 2 first-round picks and 5 in the first 3 rounds because you've got the 2/3 as well. You've got the second-round pick, so you'll get the second pick in the second round instead of the first pick in the second round. I believe that's how it works, right? So you'll get that, and then you'll get 2 picks and 2 of the higher picks in the third round. Okay, so that's 5 picks in the first 3 rounds, an opportunity to add like legitimately 5 good players. You know, and it's not to say the likelihood of hitting on all 5 players if you pick 5 players is pretty low, but you certainly have to like those odds or the chances of picking up a good player in those spots, right? Being that high up in the draft. You know, from a team building standpoint, I know a lot of people got to feel good about that, but don't feel as good as having the number one overall pick. Doesn't feel as good as having the top pick in every round. You know, it is ultimate buzzkill. And like I started the show with, man, the fact that it would be Lovie Smith coaching his heart out. The fact that I would be sitting up there with Dennis Rodman at a bar, another Chicago legend, who, by the way, if you saw the picture that I posted on social media with Dennis Rodman, was wearing a Dennis Rodman t-shirt. And I know that he's been known to do that. He is not the first person that I've met either who does that long after their heyday. Like I could actually see from a marketing and branding standpoint, guys who are still relevant who are still building their brands, wearing their own paraphernalia type of thing. Like if you're still hot, but the idea that the sort of bygone era superstar would be wearing their own paraphernalia is funny to me. And Dennis Rodman was certainly wearing a Chicago Bulls Dennis Rodman t-shirt. Yes, he was. The only other one that I was going to say, the only person who I can remember doing that, I met Evander Holyfield as a kid. And this was, and just kind of show how young I am. This was, I say I met Evander Holyfield as a kid. And even as a kid, he was already kind of done at that point. Was not still, I would say, relevant in boxing at the moment, but was wearing Evander Holyfield gear at the airport when I met him. Feel like this would have had to have been pre 9/11 because I don't remember the airport being busy and hectic the way it is today. But those stand out to me, and it stands out to me that I would be surrounded by Chicago legend on a day where Houston does Chicago the ultimate favor that was just beyond unnecessary and buzz killing and gut punching, and still not the end of the world because the Texans have a hell of an opportunity if they can get a few things right. And that brings me to Lovie Smith's firing. The Texans won this game, okay, which means they won. If I have this right, it means that they won two of their last three games and were competitive in four of their last five games, because you would factor in the overtime loss to the Kansas City Chiefs and the week before that, being competitive all the way to the end there with the Hail Mary against the Dallas Cowboys. So they played the Cowboys tough, played the Chiefs tough all the way into overtime, beat the Titans, a non-event basically against the Jaguars, which seemed like it was, just part of the cause, part of, and I know there was some outrage there for how bad it looked in some of the moments that we experienced and saw in that game, namely more plays to Rex Burkhead on critical down and distance situations. But they did lose that game. They did play awful, and it seemed like they were back on track to getting the number one overall pick. But turns out that game was actually an outlier for how they ended the season. Because again, what is this? Yeah, won two of the last three, and then were competitive at the very least in four of their last five games. But despite that, okay, and I agree with this decision to fire Lovie Smith, and I agree with the idea that you wouldn't allow being competitive in four of the last five games to cloud your judgment or I guess conflate or confuse exactly what you had seen throughout the entire season, the entire body of work, and really just the realization, okay, the realization that Lovie Smith was not going to be the coach of the future. I think you probably knew that when he was hired, but that was sort of confirmed and honestly reinforced in ways that I wasn't expecting it to be, and was hoping that it wouldn't be throughout the season. That not only is Lovie Smith not the head coach of the future, but he is so obviously and clearly not the head coach of the future. And, it's just, unfortunate because, like I said in the previous episode, I think that if Lovie Smith at the very least had coached up to what I thought his potential was closer to being, or at least had been, if this staff had been the upgrade that I thought it was going to be from the previous staff, from the staff last year, if they had actually been that, then I think that Lovie Smith would have made a fine case for himself to return for a second season, and this, possibly the entire staff would have made a good case to return for at least one more year. So, but that didn't happen. Okay, and the Texans fired Lovie Smith. They won this game and fired Lovie Smith before the night was even over with. They did not wait for, and I'm actually glad for this because I don't like that they call it Black Monday anyway. And since we're having this awkward and uncomfortable conversation about black head coaches and how they're treated, what kind of positions that they're put into, is it fair and all of that, I don't like confusing that because the Black Monday thing is more of a retail reference and obviously not a reference to race. But I don't like the coincidence. I don't like the irony. So I'm glad from that standpoint that they did not wait until Black Monday to fire their second one and done black head coach. I appreciate that. I don't know how much that factored into anything. It probably did not. But just from an optics standpoint, I think people talk about not caring about the optics and disregarding the optics. I'm glad that wasn't it. I'm glad that you're not firing the black head coach, back to back one and done black head coaches on Black Monday. Appreciate that at the very least. But Lovie Smith gone after one season. As I mentioned, that's back to back one and done coaches. And a couple of things on this, man. I've seen the narrative on this twisted in every which direction, and what folks have decided to fixate on and decide what is problematic exactly about this, why this is an issue. You see a lot of national outcry about exactly what I just described, hiring and firing a black head coach after one season, not really giving him a chance to prove himself beyond the one season. Like even if you acknowledge that the one season wasn't any good, or that they showed themselves, and I would say this, I would agree with this, that they both showed themselves, David Culley and Lovie Smith, to not be the coach of the future in the one season that they were given. The idea that they wouldn't be given more time to prove that notion wrong, to prove themselves, to improve the same way that a lot of players are given, like a first round draft pick is usually given, and a second round draft pick are usually given more than one season to prove themselves, right? A GM, we were talking about this on the last podcast. A general manager is given several years before you really feel like you can just decide what they are as a general manager or as an executive. Okay, they get that grace just because the timeline feels a lot different. The timeline of evaluation feels a lot different, but it doesn't really have to be, especially in a situation like this. And I think that's where a lot of the hang up is for like people who are looking at this maybe not as close to the situation, don't really know how bad of a coach Lovie Smith was this year, or how bad of I don't want to just say Lovie specifically, because I don't think Lovie by himself was bad. I think that the staff overall was bad, and mainly Pep Hamilton. Like, the defense wasn't good, and I'm not a big fan of Lovie's defensive scheme, but I thought the areas in which they fell short defensively had a lot more to do with talent gaps and talent deficiencies than they did just the scheme itself. I thought it was a mix, but I mean, because you can make that argument about them misusing Derek Stingley, but I don't feel like Derek Stingley being a cover two corner instead of a man corner was the reason why the defense was bad. Okay, actually thought the secondary was pretty good, all things considered. The fact is that they just had a bunch of guys, kind of, a hodgepodge of dudes on there along the defensive line, and for a while could not stop the run, could not tackle. The linebacker play was subpar for a nice portion of the season, until Christian Harris got healthy, a rookie, by the way, who showed flashes but also played like a rookie, I think, at times. And if you're expecting that to be the savior of your front seven, then that's probably not a good look. Like, I thought the issues defensively were much more talent focused than anything. But like, even if you can acknowledge that Lovie Smith and his staff were not, I said in the last episode that they're not maximizers. If you want to just say that they were flat out bad this year, that's fine. If you want to say that David Culley's staff was flat out bad in 2021, wouldn't really disagree with you there. I didn't see anything that I was necessarily impressed with there either. It was actually more confusing than anything how you even had this collection of coaches with David Culley as the head coach, Tim Kelly, a holdover from the previous staff, as the offensive coordinator, and then Lovie Smith with no connection really to either, okay, as the defensive coordinator. It was a really odd sort of collection of folks there that you had as the staff just did not make any sense. This one seemed like it made more sense and just was not particularly any good. But I think a fair point that a lot of the skeptics about this will make, even if, and I think two things can be true at the same time, that those could be bad coaches, bad coaching hires, but also a level of skepticism and weariness when you look at a team that doesn't seem willing to allow its coaching staff to improve or prove itself over time, especially in the dog days of the franchise. Like, go back to 2021 and you could still even apply it to right now, considering that they are set up to pick number 2 overall and don't really have a whole lot of high end talent. Yeah, they got this opportunity to get a lot of it in this draft, but these last couple of years just have not had it. And like, you look at that and you say, okay, neither one of these coaches was given an opportunity to really prove themselves beyond the 1 year. They only got the one, even if the 1 year was bad. The lack of patience, and this to me would have been logic that you could have applied even if these coaches were white. I don't know if you get the same fervor. I'm gonna be honest, I don't think you do. And I think the fact that they are black does mean something, and like matters in terms of like trying to point to just what data you have about what jobs black coaches get, and how much patience they are afforded once they get those jobs, the impossible jobs that they get. Okay, like I think all of that is fair, but you could have even applied this to white coaches had they been white. Like, the idea that neither one of them would be given an extra year to prove themselves, to me, like, you're gonna get all of the backlash that I think is fair about what kind of opportunities black coaches are getting, and being put in position to, whether they're being put in position to succeed. Like, the pushback to that from Texans fans and people who are sympathetic to the Texans or view the Texans in a positive light, naturally inclined to think positively about the Texans. Those people would say, "Hey, David Culley and Lovie Smith were never going to get another job. No one else was going to hire them." List the names of teams, list the teams that were going to even interview these guys. Who was interested in either one of these guys to be their head coach? And you would say nobody. I think that's a fact. Nobody was going to hire David Culley. You don't see the interest there now, right? And nobody's going to hire Lovie Smith. And I think that is fair, and something to consider. But at the same time, the Texans did. Okay, like, you can say, "Oh, well, nobody else would have done this." Well, the Texans did. The Texans did. And so there is a fair question to ask there of, okay, so they did it with the intention of doing what? What were they trying to accomplish? Okay, what were they trying to accomplish? And I just see the easy and convenient answer always being, "Hey man, didn't nobody want this job? Didn't nobody want this job?" Like, they couldn't get a viable candidate because of the mess, because of Deshaun Watson wanting to be traded, and after wanting to be traded, and still while wanting to be traded, also having sexual assault allegations tied to his name that made it more difficult to trade him. At the very least, seemed to delay the effort to trade him. Factoring into, therefore factoring into the past couple of head coaching searches, having all of that hanging over their head, the salary cap situation, what Bill O'Brien and Jack Easterby did to the salary cap situation, sort of ruining their ability to go out and get quality free agents the way you might ideally want to be able to do so, right? So not having the draft capital, being held hostage by a problematic situation with your franchise quarterback, like all of these historical sort of mishaps and unfortunate situations that the team was in, like, therefore it means that did nobody want this job, did nobody want to be here. Okay, well, if that's the case, y- somehow it's true that nobody wanted to be here, but you found in the 2 years that nobody wanted to be here, you found two guys who apparently wanted to be here, or two guys who you could apparently pay to be here and coach through this mud these last couple of years, which was going to be mud either way, no matter who coached it. So like I understand the logic and not understanding how, if you're looking at a team that is gonna be bad because of the situation that it's in, because of the previous regime, the situation that they put them in, if they're going to be bad, why cycle through coaches and not just go with one through that, or at the very least, not maybe not just go through one, go with one, but at least give one more than 1 year to prove himself, or to simply just get you through this transition until you hire the coach that you actually believe in. And that to me is the other side. Like if you don't want to buy into, oh, this was unfair, or oh, this, this wasn't this isn't like an indictment on how the Texans treat black coaches or anything like that. Like, I think that you should be worried, if you're a Texans fan, still beyond the race factor, about what this season and what these last two coaching searches and two coaching hires say about the team, say about the organization, and what they say about the team's reputation around the league. Like, what does this season do to the Texans' reputation around the league? Being arguably the worst team in the league throughout the year, but still at the very end unable to secure the number one overall pick because you got the best coaching performance of the year from the coach that was ultimately going to be fired and not last through the night. And then on top of that, it being back to back one and done situations. You know what I've noticed? And I asked this question because I really want to know, or really wish that I knew the answer. Like, when I say, what does this season do to the Texans' reputation around the league? I don't know if I really care as much about what it does around the league per se, but I really, really would be curious to know what it does. What does this season and what do these last two seasons do for, a matter of fact, I'm going to change this on the video here, because that's what I want to know. What do these last, I'm writing this, I know for the podcast, the audio version, this isn't going to make a lot of sense, but I'm writing this in real time. What do these last two seasons, I wrote one season, but what do these last two seasons do to the Texans' reputation around the league? I think that that is the question. Not just this one season, but the last two seasons do to their reputation around the league. And as I was saying, I don't care as much about around the league as much as I do. When I say around the league, what I'm really talking about is prospective candidates, prospective head coaching candidates. What do they think about all of this? What are their questions about all of this? What level of skepticism would they have about this organization from the top? Okay, or I should say starting at the top. And when I say top, I'm talking about the McNairs and Nick Caserio, because those are the decision makers. Those are the ones that are going to still be around, right? Those are the ones that are likely to survive even the next head coach, right? Certainly the McNairs, okay? What do they think about this? Because one thing that I've noticed is that everyone who wants to sell you, or everyone who is sold on the future of this franchise, the 11 draft picks, the three, or I should say the five in the first three rounds, the cap space, the number two overall pick now it is, like, everyone who is sold on that and is willing to sell that to others, from what I can tell, and maybe this is just me being in my own echo chamber and being a part of the Texans media complex and all of that, like I'm connected to it, and y'all are the ones that I'm talking to for the most part. But everyone who does that has an affinity or affection for the Texans, has some sort of bias for the Texans. Like, and that doesn't mean that, I mean, if I'm talking about media or fans, that doesn't mean that you're willing to hold their water all the time, that you're willing to make excuses for them all the time. It doesn't mean that you're not willing to criticize the organization ever. But it does mean that you tend to view the Texans through rose-colored lenses and would like to view the Texans in the most positive light as you possibly could. Any chance that you can get, any hope that you can cling to, any positive that you can point out, you would like to highlight it and make it be sort of a prevailing thought and sentiment, when that is just not necessarily the case. And I think perception is just as much reality as reality is reality in this sort of situation. Like, everyone who tries to say that the Texans' job is a good one and a desirable one and one that prospective head coaches should want to have, already has rose-colored glasses and a sort of just positive disposition already inclined to think positively, or at least want to think positively about the team. The coaches that they'll be going after are not necessarily that. They are people who are looking at it from the outside and would have both, or I should say, they should have both whatever questions are had internally. And when I say internally, I mean within the Texans media and fan base, like whatever skepticism exists already from people who are inclined to think positively about the Texans. They've got those concerns, okay? And then they've got the concerns from the people that are looking at it from the outside, that don't necessarily know all of the nuance, that the ones that are just willing to say, oh, they fired David Culley and Lovie Smith and didn't give him a chance, without actually having watched any of the games and not knowing how bad David Culley or Lovie Smith were. Like, they can have that opinion. They can marry those opinions with the skepticism of, hey, but isn't this the guy who isn't Nick Caserio the same guy that gave a bunch of money to Brandon Cooks and then failed to trade him? Isn't this the guy who, the last time he was doing a coaching search, or getting ready to hire a new coach, he was wanting to hire his staff, and the staff before that was hired by management? Do I feel like I really have, even if I'm allowed to hire my own staff, do I feel like I really have control over my own staff? Can I feel good about that? Maybe I'm not going to be a one and done coach, but if things don't go the way exactly they want them to go, that I could feel it's more likely that my staff is going to have to change at the very least after 1 year, because they do, after all, want to manipulate the staff. Do I want a general manager that wears sneakers and or feels like he's in cleats and is in the coaching booth and feels like he himself is an extension of the coaching staff? Do I want my boss to be an extension of my staff? Do I want that? And so I think that if you're looking at the attractiveness of this job, the potential attractiveness of this job for the Texans, and just simply doing it through the assets that they have, through the draft picks, through the money, through the opportunity, I think all of that is based on hope and not results. And I said in the previous podcast that I feel like the Texans are still auditioning, should still be auditioning for their next head coach, because their management and their roster and their overall organization has not shown itself to be something that is desirable. The only thing that anyone is able to point to as being desirable is the hope in cashing in on the assets. But if you go into it looking at it, oh, they got the number 2 overall pick. Oh, they've got 5 picks in the first 3 rounds. Oh, they've got all this money to spend under the cap for the first time in however many years. But you've got serious and valid questions about the people in charge of making all of those things come together and actually work, if you have doubts that the folks in charge are going to put you in a situation or in a position to succeed in this situation the way that they did not with the previous two head coaches, regardless of the quality of coaches that they weren't put in situations to succeed. Like saying that those two coaches weren't going to be hired by anybody else does ignore the fact that they were put in impossible situations to succeed, that they were not going to win or do much of anything under these circumstances. And I think both things can be true, and we don't have to be dense about it and pretend like it's one or the other. Oh, if they were good coaches, then if they were good coaches, then what? What would have been the tangible difference in what this team would have been able to do based off of all of the things that everyone acknowledges were working against the organization, the reason why it couldn't accumulate talent. I think both things can be true. They weren't good coaches. They also weren't coaches that were put in good situations to succeed. If you are a good coach or perceive yourself to be a good coach or a hot coaching candidate in this market, why would you not have questions that I feel like most of us acknowledge are valid about this organization at the very top? I put it out there on Sports Radio 610 because In the Loop did the segment, and I put it on the website, put it out on social media, and the response was wicked. Do you trust, and this was Landry Locker's poll to the people, do you trust Cal McNair or Nick Caserio? Do you trust the poll was actually, do you trust Cal McNair, Nick Caserio, both or neither? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I feel like Nick Caserio and neither were the ones that rated over 40% or that voted out over 40%. And so you've got a good amount of the fan base that trusts Nick Caserio, but less than 50%. This is very unscientific. This is Landry Locker's poll, and there were about 1,000 votes. But I do think it's instructive. I think that the data is valid enough to be instructive in this case. And Landry has a really good, a really loyal Texans following, and is one of the more, I think, enthusiastic and finger on the pulse type of Texans media members that you'll find out there. So, or especially like voices, opinion guys, right? So less than 50%, but more than 40%. I don't have the poll right up in front of me, but less than 50% voted for Caserio. Barely anybody voted for both or for Cal McNair. And then it was more than 40, but less than 50% that voted neither. So you've got a healthy amount of folks that don't trust. And again, you have a healthy amount of folks who participated in this poll, I'm assuming because they more than likely care to some degree about the Texans. Okay. I can't say that all 1,026 people who voted in this are for sure Texans fans, but let's just say you've got a healthy amount of folks, even within the Texans fan base, that does not believe and does not trust in Cal McNair and Nick Caserio, in either of them, and certainly in the two as a pairing. If that's the case amongst the fan base, it's not unreasonable to think that that would be the case from potential head coaching candidates when you consider how they're being talked about around the league. Like, it's hard for me to acknowledge that they are a laughing stock around the league, to acknowledge that they have been a joke for the last few years, and then just ignore that, pretend like that's not true, or like I didn't just say it, and just blindly trust the attractiveness of having a bunch of picks in cap space. I can't do that. Here's what I'll say. I think having a bunch of picks and cap space is attractive. I don't necessarily think that having a bunch of picks and cap space within this organization under this set of management, under this crew of management, is attractive. And to me, I don't see how you can ignore this or how you can discount this and say that potential candidates will just look at the opportunity, and maybe this will be the case. Like, I'm not saying that this is going to just run people off and they're not going to be able to find a quality candidate, but I do think that it makes it harder when it seems like you are not an ideal place to work, or that the management there is not an ideal fit to work for. That matters. That matters to me. And if you are in a position, okay, if let's say you're not David Culley and you're not Lovie Smith and you're not the type of candidate who can only settle for this type of job, or no one else is calling you and no one else is giving you this opportunity, so you've got to settle for this type of job. Like, if you're not that and you are a quality candidate and you say have some choices or decisions to make, maybe you could go to a different place where the circumstances do not feel like this. I don't see why or how this wouldn't be a concern. Not that they don't have assets, or not that they, have a quarterback who doesn't want to be there and is holding them hostage with a no trade clause and has sexual assault allegations. Not that they don't have cap space. Not that, but that the working environment and the working conditions might be of such that are not desirable to you or not preferable to you if you have a choice. Like, that to me is a valid concern. I don't understand how Texans fans could not feel that. And like, even in the same breath as they acknowledge that Lovie Smith and David Culley possibly should not have been hired, and certainly should not have been retained as head coaches. But at the same time, the fact that they were hired and that they were fired after 1 year, like, we got to deal with the reality. This did happen. How does that reflect on the organization, and what is the impact on the candidate pool? Like, how can you feel good about those candidates feeling good about working under this management that you yourself do not trust? Why should they trust them? You tell me. Y'all tell me. Look, aside from just simply having the assets, aside from having the draft picks, aside from having the cap space, aside from not having the drama of Deshaun Watson or Jackie used to be lingering around and all of that, like, aside from all of that, what is the reason to be confident in the people in charge of making this perfect storm, this perfect confluence of events? Okay, what is it that makes you confident about their ability to handle that and manage that? Or why wouldn't a prospective coach of quality not have serious stability questions about the general manager and the owner, CEO, and chairman? Why would they not have those questions? I don't get that. So this is not a point to say that they shouldn't have fired Lovie Smith. This is not a point to say that they shouldn't have fired David Culley necessarily. But I do think what would have avoided a lot of this conversation, both about how they're treating black coaches supposedly, and whether there's stability and competency at the top of this organization, is if they had just hired one of those guys and let that guy get them through the mud of these couple of years. For the result that you got with Lovie Smith this year, you might as well have kept David Culley last year. And for the result that you got from Lovie Smith this year, you could have just hired him last year and had just one of those guys for 2 years. Now, neither guy is one and done, and you haven't hired 2 coaches in 2 years, or about to hire 3 coaches in 3 years. You did this to yourself. The Texans did this to themselves. They do not have the built up equity. They do not have the trust. They don't have any of that. No credibility, None of it. So you can acknowledge assets, you can acknowledge draft picks and money and opportunity and hope traffic all you want. You can do it. Free country. It's up to you. Do what you want to do. But you can't have that and then just subtract the credibility issue that exists with the organization, specifically with the decision makers. All of those things go together. Okay? It's a package deal. The assets and the hope and everything that makes the job attractive is over here, and the lack of credibility and the questions about stability surrounding upper management is over here, and you bring them together, and all of that is the context of this job and the future of this organization and who wants to be a part of it, who wants to do it. And look, again, somebody is going to want to do it. Somebody is going to want to do it. And that somebody might actually be somebody of quality. I'm not saying that they're not going to be able to find a good head coach. I'm saying that the process and the way that they've gone about it these last couple of years and the results that they've gotten over these last couple of years, to me, has damaged their ability to do so. It has at the very least hurt their credibility, and that in no way can be a good thing. Doesn't make it impossible, doesn't make it the end of the world, but it's not a good thing that you're bringing in a prospective head coach and they got to interview you just as much as you got to interview them. As they should, but with way more skepticism, I feel like. Way more skepticism. Imagine if you're a prospective, imagine if you're Ben Johnson or DeMeco Ryans, and all of the places where there's a head coaching opening or a head coach opening call you up. I feel like, with the exception of Arizona, where ownership has been laughable for years, I feel like the Texans are the ones that have maybe the best set of assets and opportunity and hope traffic that you could sell, hope trafficking that you could sell, but also are right up there with having the worst reputation and credibility issue that you could sell. I don't think you get to acknowledge one without the other. I don't think you can go on the other side either and say, hey, the Texans have credibility issues and therefore the assets that they have aren't going to matter. No, I think the fact that they're willing to spend money, willing to waste money on coaches, I think that matters, and the fact that they might be able to money whip a coach, it might not matter. The credibility issues can be there, and somebody looks at it and says, hey, I'm gonna try it anyway because it's 1 of 32, and really we're misrepresenting and underselling it when we say 1 of 32 because only 5, 6, 7 jobs open up every year, so it's really one of those. And hey, maybe somebody's gonna say, yeah, I'll do that. I'll take that chance. I'll be David Culley. I'll be Lovie Smith. I know I damn sure would be. I mean, both of those guys, I'm sure, made more money in this 1 year and from this one contract with the Texans than I can ever dream of to make in my life. I'd do it. Damn right I'd do it. I'm sure that they'll be able to find somebody. I ain't no quality coach or anything, but I'm pretty sure they'll be able to find somebody that'll do it. But I don't think you get to say, hey, there's credibility issues here, and the hope that's there is not going to factor in. It's hopeless. No, it's not hopeless. Hope is there, but while hope is there, and while assets are there, while there are reasons to take this job, there are also reasons to not. There are also reasons to be skeptical of it. There are also reasons to raise serious questions about who's in charge and whether they know what the hell they're doing and whether you should entrust your future with them, whether you should attach your name and your brand and, again, your future to this outfit. I think that's a valid concern and something that prospective candidates are going to have to ask themselves. How do these last couple of seasons, what do these last 2 seasons do to the Texans' reputation around the NFL, specifically with high quality prospective head coaching candidates? I would like to know the answer. Went a little long today, but publishing this on a Monday afternoon. It's a reaction Monday. Brandon Scott on the B Block podcast. Thought it was important to get in here. A few hours away from here, or from doing this, from recording this, I'm going to be going over to NRG Stadium to, at the very least, see and hear what Cal McNair and Nick Caserio are going to have to say about firing Lovie Smith and their third head coaching search in as many seasons, and hopefully bring some answers back to you guys as soon as possible. In the meantime, you'll be able to find plenty of it on Sports Radio 610, sportsradio610.com, but also right here on the B Block, doing this thing hopefully more frequently here in the new year. We're gonna figure out how often we're gonna exactly do this, but certainly to start the week, every Tuesday we'll be doing this, and coming to you now on a Reaction Monday at a time where reaction was certainly much needed. But that's it for this episode. I appreciate y'all for being here. Again, I'm Brandon Scott with the B Block Podcast. Make sure that you are rating, reviewing, and telling anybody that you can about the podcast, because if you made it this far, I'm assuming that there was something that kept you. So let somebody else know about it. Until next time, man, y'all be good.